I'll never forget the day the fire came. Started like any other dry summer morning. Too hot, too still, the kind of day where the air feels thick and heavy. The sun hung low in a sky bleached pale by the relentless heat, casting sharp, unforgiving shadows across the town. I was sitting in my shop downtown, a modest place I'd poured my heart into over the past 10 years. The scent of wood shavings and varnish filled the room, grounding me in a sense of familiarity that felt unshakable. Jamie, my 10-year-old son, was perched on a stool in the corner, his face alight with concentration as he flew a model plane through the air. His laughter filled the space, bouncing off the walls like music. "Look, Dad, it's soaring over the mountains," he exclaimed, his voice tinged with uncontainable joy. I glanced over, smiling. It was moments like these that made the long days worth it. The simple, unfiltered wonder of childhood. Around noon, the power flickered, then cut out completely. I didn't think much of it. Outages weren't uncommon during the summer's peak heat. But then, faint at first, I heard it, the distant wail of sirens. They grew louder, more insistent, and an unease settled over me like a shadow. I stepped outside, shielding my eyes from the glare of the sun. That's when I saw it. A dark plume of smoke curling into the sky on the horizon, stark against the brilliant blue. It rose steadily, spreading like an ink stain on paper, an ominous warning of what was to come. The fire had started miles away, somewhere deep in the hills beyond the city. A careless spark, maybe, or the result of the unforgiving heat. No one knew for sure. By the time we understood the gravity of the situation, it was too late. The wind, fierce and unrelenting, drove the flames faster than anyone could comprehend. I turned back toward the shop, my heart pounding. "Jamie," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to go, now." We moved quickly, grabbing what little we could in the span of minutes. I stuffed a backpack with water, snacks, and a few of Jamie's favorite toys. My hands shook as I reached for the photo album on the shelf, the one filled with pictures of Emily, my late wife. Leaving everything else behind felt like leaving pieces of myself, but the urgency left no room for sentimentality. Outside, the streets were chaos. Cars jammed the narrow roads, their horns blaring as people scrambled to escape. Faces pressed against windows, pale, wide-eyed, desperate. The air was thick with smoke now, acrid and choking, and ash began to drift down like morbid snowflakes. Jamie clung to my hand, his fingers digging into mine as we joined the crowd heading for the evacuation center. When we reached the school gym, it was already brimming with people. Rows of cots stretched wall to wall, and volunteers moved through the throng, handing out bottles of water and blankets. The hum of voices filled the air, murmurs of worry, the occasional sharp cry of a child. Government officials stood at the front, their voices amplified by megaphones as they tried to impose order. They assured us they were doing everything they could, but the fear in their eyes told a different story. As night fell, the fire inched closer, its glow a sinister beacon on the horizon. It lit the sky in shades of angry orange and blood red, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the ground. The heat was oppressive, even from miles away, and the smoke made every breath a struggle. Jamie, exhausted, eventually fell asleep in my lap. His face was streaked with ash, his small body curled against mine for comfort. I stroked his hair, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. The next day, the fire reached the edge of the city. I'll never forget the sound, a deafening roar that seemed to consume everything. It was more than noise. It was alive, a monstrous force that devoured all in its path. Buildings crumbled under the relentless heat, their frames groaning before collapsing into glowing embers. The ground trembled with the fire's fury, and people ran in every direction, their cries drowned by the inferno. Amid the chaos, a woman's scream cut through. "My daughter! She's missing!" she cried, her voice raw with desperation. I turned, my eyes scanning the panicked crowd. She was clutching the hand of a young boy, but her daughter was nowhere to be seen. Without thinking, I handed Jamie to a nearby volunteer. "Take care of him," I said, my voice firm despite the fear knotting in my chest. The smoke was so thick it was like walking through a nightmare. Every breath burned my lungs, and the heat pressed against my skin like a living thing. I called out, my voice hoarse and barely audible over the fire's roar. Finally, I found her. She was crouched under a table in what remained of her living room, her small frame trembling. "It's okay," I said, kneeling beside her. "I've got you." I wrapped her in my jacket, shielding her as best I could, and we ran. The house groaned behind us, the fire consuming it with terrifying speed. Just as we reached the street, part of the roof gave way, sending a cascade of sparks and debris raining down. I stumbled but didn't stop, my focus locked on getting her to safety. When we made it back to the evacuation center, the mother's sob of relief was the only thing that kept me upright. She clutched her daughter tightly, tears streaming down her face. But my relief was short-lived. Jamie was gone. I searched the shelter, shouting his name, my voice cracking with desperation. A volunteer grabbed my arm, pointing toward a bus that was pulling away from the curb. "They're taking him to another site," she said. Panic surged through me as I ran after the bus, my legs screaming in protest. But it was too late. The bus disappeared down the road, leaving me gasping and defeated. Hours passed before I finally found him. At the next shelter, he was sitting on a cot, clutching the photo album tightly to his chest. When he saw me, he sprang to his feet, running into my arms with a cry. I held him close, his small body trembling against mine, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. The fire took almost everything. My shop, my home, even the school where Jamie used to play on the swings. The city was unrecognizable, a blackened wasteland of ash and rubble. The government promised aid, and they delivered in the ways they could: funds, temporary housing, and the beginnings of rebuilding. But no amount of money could replace what we had lost. I lost neighbors, friends, pieces of myself I'll never recover. But I didn't lose Jamie, and that, above all else, is what kept me moving forward. Now, when I look at him, I see hope. I see resilience. We're starting over piece by piece. The scars will always be there, but so will the memories of those we loved and the lessons we learned. As long as we have each other, we'll keep going. Through the ash, through the pain, we'll rebuild. And someday, maybe, the flames will feel like a distant memory. No longer a force of destruction, but a reminder of everything we endured and everything we survived. It started with the scent of smoke, faint but unmistakable, threading through the air like a warning whispered too softly to be heard. That night, the town of Ashwood lay still in the shadow of the mountains, its forests glowing amber under a setting sun that burned too brightly, almost as if it knew something we didn't. We were far from the paved streets and weathered storefronts, 5 of us sitting around a crackling fire, laughing like we didn't have a care in the world. The flames painted flickering patterns on our faces, making our smiles seem wider and our shadows longer. Behind us, the trees stood eerily still, their tall spines reaching skyward like sentinels watching something we couldn't see. I remember leaning forward, my fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the old map we'd brought. I'm the cautious one, the planner, always calculating risks. Across from me, Derek grinned and tossed another log onto the fire, sparks leaping skyward like tiny fireflies. "This," he said, stretching his arms toward the vast wilderness around us. This is freedom. No cell service. No schedules. Just us and the wild. Us and the mosquitoes. Ellie shot back, slapping her arm dramatically. That earned her a laugh from Taylor, who was knee-deep in a bag of trail mix, and Sam, who sat quietly apart from us. Sam always seemed a little distant, his eyes flicking between the fire and the woods, as if he was waiting for something to happen. We laughed, we talked, and then the wind shifted. The smoke came on stronger, heavier, with an edge that burned in the back of your throat. I sat up straighter, staring at the ridge, where the sky had deepened to a bruised purple. A thin thread of gray smoke curled upward, blurring the horizon. "Do you smell that?" I asked, my voice cutting through the moment. Taylor sniffed, squinting toward the horizon. "Probably a controlled burn. They do that around here sometimes." But it didn't feel like a controlled burn. I kept staring at the ridge, at the faint wisp of smoke that seemed to be growing, spreading like a stain across the sky. The fire wasn't supposed to come this close, not this early in the season. Yet as the hours passed, the thread thickened, its orange glow flickering against the treetops. By the time we crawled into our tents, the forest had fallen silent. Too silent. The usual hum of crickets and rustling leaves was gone, leaving only the faint hiss of wind through dry branches. Couldn't sleep. I just lay there, staring at the roof of the tent, my stomach knotted tight for reasons I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the smoke. It was something else, something that prickled at the edge of my awareness and made my skin crawl. And then I heard it. It was faint at first, a crackle like a twig snapping underfoot, but sharper, almost like it carried heat in its very sound. Then another, and another, until it became a rhythmic whisper, moving closer, circling. My breath caught, and I sat up, straining to listen. The air felt heavy, like the smoke had sunk low to the ground, creeping through the trees like a living thing. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness in a shaky beam. The glow on the ridge had grown brighter, pulsing faintly through the trees like a heartbeat. Shadows stretched long and jagged across the clearing, their edges flickering as though alive. "Hello," I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. The campfire had burned down to glowing embers, but something felt wrong. The crackling sound had stopped, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves. Except I wasn't moving. Then a low hum began, so faint at first that I thought I imagined it. But it grew louder, steady and rhythmic, vibrating through the air like a living pulse. When the others emerged, groggy and confused, I could barely get the words out. "It's closer. What's closer?" Mia asked, but I could only point toward the ridge. The glow was too close now, too bright. Whatever it wasn't waiting for morning. It was already here. The ridge glowed brighter as the fire began to spread, its edges licking hungrily at the treetops. The air around us thickened with the acrid sting of smoke, and every breath felt heavier than the last. It was as if the forest itself was alive and tightening its grip. Mia was the first to take control. Her voice, steady but sharp, broke through our panic. "We need to move. Now." "Move where?" Ellie snapped, hugging herself as she glanced at the ridge. "Toward that." Mia didn't argue. She turned to Taylor, who was already packing up. "Is there another trail out of here?" Taylor hesitated, and I could see the doubt in his eyes. "There's one," he said, but his voice was low. "It's not official. It cuts through Black Hollow." The name sent a chill through me. Even I had heard the warnings about Black Hollow, the stories the locals told about people who wandered in and never came out. Ellie groaned. "The Forbidden Trail. Great, perfect plan." We don't have another option, Mia shot back. We can't outrun a fire. I lingered at the edge of the clearing as the others packed up, my gaze fixed on the forest. Something was out there. I could feel it watching. What is it? Mia's voice startled me. It's watching us, I whispered, my mouth dry. We plunged into the forest, flashlights slicing through the darkness. The trail was barely a trail at all, overgrown with weeds and slick with dry leaves that crunched underfoot. Every sound felt amplified. The snap of a branch, the rustle of unseen animals, the labored breathing of the person next to me, and always the hum, low, persistent, vibrating in my chest. Behind us, the glow grew brighter, spilling through the trees in uneven bursts. The heat pressed against our backs, pushing us forward. "This doesn't make sense," Taylor muttered, his voice tight with panic. "Fires don't move this fast." "It's not the wind," I said suddenly. My voice was calm, too calm, even to my own ears. "It's something else." Before anyone could respond, a loud crack split the air, followed by the crash of a tree collapsing in the distance. We froze, our flashlights trembling as we turned toward the sound. That's when we saw them. At first, they looked like smoke, twisting and curling in unnatural patterns. But as we stared, the shapes took form. Tall, elongated figures that moved fluidly through the flames. Their edges flickered like embers caught in the wind, their movements deliberate and almost predatory. "Run," Mia whispered, and we did. We ran. Branches clawed at our arms and faces. Roots snagged at our boots, but we didn't stop. The forest felt alive, closing in around us as if it wanted to trap us, to hold us for whatever was coming. The glow from the fire wasn't just behind us anymore. It was everywhere, spilling through the trees in flickering patterns that played tricks on the mind. I glanced over my shoulder, and my stomach dropped. They were still there, the figures, tall, angular, their bodies flickering like dying flames. They moved faster now, their forms bending and twisting as they closed the gap between us. Ellie tripped ahead of me, her flashlight skittering across the ground as she fell to her knees. "Wait!" she screamed, her voice breaking with panic. I stopped, instinct overriding fear. "Get up!" I shouted, grabbing her arm. My breath caught as I saw one of the figures step onto the trail. It was only a few feet away, its form rippling like heat waves, its eyes glowing like embers. It didn't move toward us, it just stood there, watching. Ellie scrambled to her feet, and I pulled her forward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. We caught up to the others just as Taylor shouted, "The trail splits up ahead." The path forked, one route sloping sharply down into a misty ravine, the other climbing toward the ridge and the flames. Both options looked like death. "We can't go toward the fire," Ellie cried, her voice rising in hysteria. "Then we go down," Taylor said, already moving toward the ravine. He didn't wait for agreement. The rest of us followed, our feet sliding on loose rocks as we descended into the mist. The bottom of the ravine was colder, the air damp and heavy. The glow of the fire seemed to disappear as the mist thickened, curling around our legs like a living thing. Every step felt wrong, as if the ground might give way beneath us. "Is everyone okay?" Mia's voice was strained, but steady. "Define okay," Ellie muttered, clutching her flashlight like a lifeline. Taylor limped slightly, his face pale as he tried to hide the pain in his ankle. Derek was silent, his eyes darting nervously around the ravine. And then there was Sam. He stood apart from the group, staring at something only he could see. His face was pale, his hands trembling. "Sam," Mia said softly, stepping closer to him. "They're here," he whispered. "Who's here?" she pressed, but Sam only shook his head, his lips moving silently as if he was praying or pleading. A sound broke the silence, faint at first but unmistakable. A crackling like twigs snapping, but sharper, hotter. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the jagged walls of the ravine. Then, beneath it, another sound, low and resonant, like a hum. It vibrated through the stones under our feet, through the air, through our bodies. "Do you hear that?" Derek whispered. "Yeah," Taylor replied, gripping his flashlight tighter. "And I don't think it's just the wind." We moved slowly now, our steps cautious as the sound grew louder. The mist thickened with every step, and the ground beneath us changed. It was no longer rocky, it was soft, dark, and brittle. Every step sent up faint puffs of dust, the scent of burnt wood growing stronger. And then we saw it. A faint glow appeared ahead, pulsing rhythmically in time with the hum. It was too steady to be fire, too bright to be natural. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but there was no going back. The ravine walls loomed high and impassable, and the figures behind us had left no doubt about what would happen if we stopped. The glow grew brighter as we approached, revealing a clearing at the heart of the ravine. At its center stood a tree, if you could even call it that. Its trunk was blackened and gnarled, its branches twisted into unnatural shapes that seemed to claw at the sky. The bark was scarred with glowing symbols, their edges shimmering like embers. Around the base of the tree, the ground was littered with charred bones. Human bones. The hum was louder now, almost deafening. It came from the tree itself, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to seep into my skull. I felt lightheaded, unsteady, like the ground might tilt beneath me at any second. What is this?" Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's the heart of the fire," Sam said. His voice was distant, detached, like he was speaking from somewhere far away. "It's alive." The tree loomed over us, its branches casting jagged shadows that writhed and shifted as if they were alive. Couldn't look away. Something about it drew me in, despite every instinct screaming at me to run. "Mia," I heard Ellie say, her voice trembling. "Don't." But Mia stepped closer, her flashlight shaking in her hand. She reached out, her fingers brushing the bark. A searing flash of light shot through the clearing, and she cried out, stumbling backward. The hum shifted, rising in pitch, and the symbols on the tree began to twist and rearrange, glowing brighter with every second. The ground beneath us trembled, and the air grew stiflingly hot. And then they appeared. The figures emerged from the mist, stepping into the clearing. They were taller now, their forms more defined, their bodies composed entirely of flickering ash and flame. Their eyes burned with an intensity that made my stomach churn. They surrounded us, moving slowly, deliberately, cutting off any chance of escape. "Stay together," Mia shouted, pulling Sam closer as the rest of us huddled instinctively. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements fluid and unervingly graceful. It stopped a few feet away, its glowing eyes locking onto Mia. "You burned us," it said. Its voice was both a whisper and a roar, resonating through the clearing like a physical force. "What do you want?" Mia asked, her voice shaking but defiant. The figure tilted its head, as if considering her question. "To remember," it said, "and to be remembered." The clearing was silent except for the steady hum emanating from the tree, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest, pulling at my insides. Mia's voice wavered, but her resolve didn't break. "How do we do that?" she asked, taking a half step forward. Her face was pale, glistening with sweat, but her eyes stayed locked on the figure before her. The figure didn't speak right away. Its glowing eyes flickered, shifting from Mia to the rest of us, as if it were weighing something unseen. When it finally spoke, its voice was different, lower, darker, and filled with something ancient. "Make the fire whole," it said. The words made no sense, but the way the symbols on the tree flared, glowing with an almost blinding intensity, suggested they carried a meaning we weren't prepared to understand. Mia turned back toward us, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "Does anyone know what that means?" she asked, her voice tight. "We shouldn't be here. We need to leave," Ellie hissed, her flashlight trembling as she swung it wildly toward the edges of the clearing. "This is wrong. This whole place is wrong." Taylor, limping but still standing tall, shook his head. "Leave and go where? Back to them?" He gestured toward the figures, their forms still flickering at the edge of the light. "I think they'd rather burn us alive than let us walk out of here." Sam, silent until now, knelt suddenly, his hands digging into the ash beneath us. His fingers traced lines, shapes, symbols that mirrored those on the tree. His movements were frantic, almost compulsive, like he wasn't in control of himself. "Sam," I said, taking a step toward him. "What are you doing?" "They're not fire," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They're memories, anger, pain. This tree, it's holding them here." I didn't know what he meant, but the way the figures flared brighter at his words told me he might be right. He looked up at Mia, his eyes brimming with something between terror and understanding. "We have to burn it," he said. "All of it. The tree, the ash, everything." "That's insane," Ellie snapped, backing away. "We're already surrounded by fire, and you want to start one?" But Mia was already moving, her jaw set in a way that told me she believed Sam, or at least believed we had no other choice. "How?" she asked, crouching beside him. "How do we burn it?" Sam's hands shook as he pointed to the symbols glowing on the bark. "It's like a lock," he said. "A seal. They're trapped here, bound to this place. If we break it, they'll go." "Go where?" Taylor asked, his voice heavy with doubt. Sam didn't answer. Instead, he stood and reached for the lighter in his pocket. His hands fumbled as he flicked it, the tiny flame sputtering to life. The moment it did, the figures shifted. They moved closer, their forms towering, their eyes blazing with a fury that made my blood run cold. "Mia," Derek said, his voice low and urgent. "Whatever we're doing, we need to do it fast." Mia grabbed a branch from the ground, its tip dry and brittle. She held it to Sam's lighter until it caught, the flame licking hungrily up the wood. Together, they approached the tree. The heat in the clearing grew unbearable, the air shimmering like a mirage. The first touch of flame against the bark sent a ripple through the clearing, a wave of energy that knocked us all back a step. The symbols glowed brighter, their light pulsing wildly, as though they were alive and fighting against the fire. The hum turned into a roar. The figures screamed, not in pain, but in something deeper, something primal and raw. Their forms flickered wildly, the edges of their bodies breaking apart like embers carried on the wind. Mia didn't hesitate. She shoved the burning branch deeper against the tree, the flames climbing higher, faster. The bark blackened, curling away to reveal layers of glowing red beneath, like molten rock. "Keep going," Taylor shouted, his voice barely audible over the sound of the roaring fire and the deafening hum. The figures surged forward, their movements erratic, desperate. One of them reached for Sam, its hand of flame curling around his arm. He screamed, falling to his knees, but he didn't let go of the lighter. "Sam!" I yelled, rushing toward him. The heat was overwhelming, my skin burning even from a distance, but I managed to grab his other arm and pull him back. The figure released him, its form disintegrating as the fire consumed more of the tree. The symbols on the bark began to crumble, their light fading, flickering, until finally they disappeared. The tree groaned, its twisted branches collapsing inward as the fire devoured it. The ground beneath us trembled violently, the air filled with ash and smoke. And then it was over. The figures were gone. The clearing was silent except for the crackle of the dying fire. The tree was nothing more than a smoldering heap of ash and charred wood. The hum had vanished, leaving behind an emptiness that felt almost as heavy as the sound had. We stood there, dazed, covered in soot and sweat, staring at the place where the tree had stood. What just happened? Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're free," Sam said, his voice hoarse. "Or gone. I don't know." Mia turned to look at the rest of us, her face pale but resolute. "We need to leave," she said. "Now." As we climbed out of the ravine, the forest was eerily quiet. The glow from the ridge had disappeared, replaced by the cool silver light of the moon. The fire was gone, and so were the shadows. But as we reached the edge of the woods, a faint sound carried on the wind. A low, rhythmic hum, almost imperceptible. We didn't speak. We didn't stop. We just kept walking, our minds heavy with the knowledge of what we'd seen, what we'd done. Somewhere behind us, deep in the forest, the hum grew fainter, but it never truly disappeared. I think we all knew it never would. They'd be remembered. The day it started felt like the kind of dream you wake up from, but the details stick in your mind long after. That morning, the world was too still. Sunlight poured through the trees in long golden streams, and the forest floor shimmered with the kind of delicate quiet that feels almost sacred. Everything smelled alive: pine, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers. Yet, beneath all that beauty, there was something else, an unease I couldn't name. It wasn't anything I saw or heard, but I could feel it, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stood on my father's weathered porch, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The boards creaked beneath my weight as I shifted, scanning the horizon for something, anything, that would explain the knot twisting in my gut. The town stretched out below, no more than a handful of cabins scattered like fallen leaves in the hills. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and kids laughed as they darted between houses. It looked normal, peaceful, but it wasn't. A breeze stirred the air, carrying a faint, bitter scent that cut through the pine and wildflowers. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it clawed at the back of my throat. I glanced at the stray dog that sometimes wandered through town, a wiry mutt with intelligent eyes. It stopped mid-step, its body tense, nose twitching as if it too had caught the scent. Without warning, it bolted for the woods, vanishing into the shadows like it knew something we didn't. I come back to help my father clean out the old cabin. He wasn't the sentimental type, but the place was his sanctuary, even as it fell into disrepair. The peeling paint curled like old parchment, and the garden, once bursting with vegetables and wildflowers, was now a tangle of weeds. My camera hung heavy on my shoulder as I stepped out of the truck, my boots crunching on gravel. Dad appeared in the doorway, his silhouette outlined against the dim interior. His face was lined, not just with age but with years of quiet worry that he never put into words. We didn't say much. We never did. He gave me a nod, and I returned it, a silent agreement that words weren't necessary. Together, we began the work, pulling out boxes of faded photographs, old tools, and forgotten keepsakes. The air inside smelled of dust and wood smoke, a combination that brought back memories of winters spent by the fire, listening to the wind howl through the trees. Across town, Sam was locking up the schoolhouse. He always stayed late, tending to the garden beds behind the building, even though the summer heat had reduced most of the plants to shriveled stalks. He waved when he saw me drive by earlier, his smile faint, his movements distracted. I thought about stopping to talk, but there was always tomorrow. There was always time, or so I thought. Maggie sat on her porch at the edge of town, her favorite spot. She was old, older than anyone could remember, and had a way of seeing things before the rest of us. Her hands cradled a steaming mug, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She didn't wave or call out, but there was something in her stillness that caught my attention. I followed her gaze and saw it. A thin, curling wisp of gray rising into the pristine blue sky. At the time, it was so faint it could have been a trick of the light, but Maggie's expression told me otherwise. By the time the sun began its slow descent, the air had changed. The warmth was no longer gentle. It pressed down, heavy and stifling. The birds had gone silent, their absence louder than their songs. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath, their leaves still as statues. I stood on the porch, watching the horizon. That's when I saw it. An orange glow, too bright to be the setting sun. It flickered, alive and hungry, and my chest tightened with a nameless dread. "Dad!" My voice broke the silence, trembling as it escaped my throat. He came to the door, his face pale and drawn as he followed my gaze. For a moment he didn't move. Then he turned to me, his voice low and firm. "Get inside." No argument, no explanation, just those two words. The glow grew brighter as night fell, and with it came the unmistakable roar. It wasn't just sound. It was a presence, a living thing that devoured everything in its path. Flames leaped into the sky, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the ground. Trees exploded into infernos, their resin popping like gunfire. The air turned thick and acrid, choking the lungs with every breath. People spilled into the streets, their faces a kaleidoscope of fear and disbelief. I saw Sam running toward his truck, his arms full of books and papers, his face streaked with sweat and soot. Maggie's porch was empty, her mug abandoned on the railing. The stray dog reappeared, darting between legs and vehicles, its eyes wild with panic. My camera hung useless at my side. What was the point of capturing this? Who would want to remember? Sirens wailed in the distance, a futile echo against the roar of the fire. People shouted, their voices lost in the chaos. Some packed cars, shoving in whatever they could grab. Others stood frozen, staring at the flames as if sheer willpower could hold them back. The heat was unbearable, a wall of energy that seared the skin and sapped the strength. Dad grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the truck. "There's a mining tunnel," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. He held up a faded blueprint, the edges yellowed with age. "It'll get us out." We didn't have time to argue. Grabbing what little we could, we ran for the woods. The tunnel entrance was hidden among the trees, a black maw in the earth that seemed to swallow the light from our flashlights. The air inside was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the inferno above, but the roar of the flames was never far, a constant reminder of what we were fleeing. When we emerged on the other side, the sight stole the breath from my lungs. The town was gone. Just ash and rubble stretched as far as the eye could see, smoke rising in delicate spirals into a sky too bright with stars. It was wrong, so wrong, to see such beauty above such devastation. The silence was deafening, a void where life had once thrived. In the days that followed, we began to rebuild. People came together in ways I had never seen before, their grief tempered by a stubborn resilience. I used my camera to document everything: the charred remains of homes, the first tentative shoots of green pushing through the blackened ground, the smiles that returned, fragile but genuine. Maggie's cabin was the only one left standing, but she was gone. Her chair sat empty on the porch, her teacup cold and untouched. I like to think she'd known somehow, that she'd seen what was coming and made her peace with it. I still think about that day, about everything we lost and everything we found. The fire took so much, but it left something behind, too. A lesson, maybe, or a reminder of how fragile life can be. Or perhaps it was just a spark, igniting something new in all of us. Something that would grow no matter how much the flames tried to take it away.